The word Lebensborn has long been shrouded in confusion, half-truths, and dark speculation. Over the decades, it has become a magnet for myth, portrayed in films, headlines, and conspiracy theories as some kind of secret Nazi breeding cult, complete with ritualistic eugenics and bizarre sexual experiments. But the real story is far more complex. In this documentary, we go beyond the rumours and sensationalism. We dive into the truth, what the Lebensborn program actually was, why it was created, and how it operated inside and outside of Germany. We'll explore the ideology that gave birth to it, the role of the SS, the strict racial criteria, and the real experiences of the women and children involved, some who volunteered, others who were taken. Lebensborn was established in 1935 under the direction of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, as part of a broader effort to increase the birth rate among what the regime classified as racially valuable Germans. Himmler was deeply concerned with demographic trends and believed that the future of the Germanic peoples depended on a rise in population and the preservation of their perceived hereditary traits. He saw history as a constant struggle between different ethnic and racial groups, each with its own qualities and destiny. To ensure the strength and continuity of the Germanic population, Himmler believed that growth in numbers, isolation from what he viewed as undesirable mixing, and territorial expansion were essential. These ideas were not invented by the SS or the Nazi Party. They originated from decades of racial theory, pseudo-scientific thinking, and nationalistic writings that circulated across Europe and the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Beliefs about racial hierarchies, hereditary character, and selective breeding were already deeply rooted in many societies by the time the National Socialists came to power. However, after Germany's defeat in the First World War and the political and economic crises that followed, these ideas found particularly fertile ground within the country. After assuming power in 1933, the regime began to implement its racial theories through legal and institutional means. Early measures focused on so-called racial hygiene, including forced sterilizations. Later, during the war years, these policies escalated into wider programs of ethnic resettlement, selective assimilation. Himmler was central to both aspects of this racial policy. While overseeing deportations and population transfers, he also devoted resources to increasing the birth rate of children classified as genetically suitable by the SS. Lebensborn became the centerpiece of this latter effort. Beginning in 1936, the program operated a network of maternity homes, child welfare centers, and boarding facilities designed to support expectant mothers deemed to meet racial criteria. These institutions provided secrecy and social protection to women carrying children fathered by members of the SS or other men considered of ideal Germanic stock. The goal was to provide the ideal environment for raising the next generation of leaders and citizens for a future Greater Germanic Reich. In Western Europe, Lebensborn maintained this role of support and care. However, in occupied Eastern and Central Europe, the program took on a darker function. In these regions, SS officials and affiliated personnel conducted systematic searches for children who displayed such physical characteristics. Thousands of these children were removed from their families and sent to Germany to be Germanized, given new identities, placed with adoptive families, and raised as part of the Reich's future population. Himmler believed this process would both strengthen the Germanic people and prevent the rise of new nationalist elites in conquered territories. The Lebensborn program remains one of the most controversial and unsettling aspects of wartime racial policy. It represented a calculated, systematic approach to population engineering, combining ideology with bureaucracy in an effort to reshape the future of an entire continent through control over birth, identity, and childhood. In the summer of 1936, more than 3 years after the National Socialists came to power, the Lebensborn program opened its first branch. It was a maternity clinic known as Heim Hochland, situated in the village of Steinhöring, about 30 kilometers east of Munich. Over the following years, the program would expand to include dozens of additional clinics, children's homes, and boarding houses. These were initially established in Germany and Austria and later extended into occupied countries across Northern and Western Europe. Each facility was intended to support women deemed to meet the strict criteria of the state's racial policies, providing them with medical care, financial support, and housing during and after pregnancy. Lebensborn was administered by the SS and maintained a strong level of secrecy. The clinics were typically located on large, secluded estates and operated with limited public access. Local populations often observed pregnant women, young mothers, and uniformed SS personnel entering and exiting the grounds, but few understood what was actually happening inside. This secrecy gave rise to rumours, including speculation that the program involved selective breeding or state-sponsored pairings between men and women. These stories were amplified in later years by films and novels, often focusing on themes of coercion, secrecy, and exploitation. However, post-war investigations into Lebensborn yielded mixed conclusions. During the Nuremberg trials, members of the program's leadership were brought before an American military tribunal. The court ultimately ruled that Lebensborn, as an institution, had functioned primarily as a charitable organization designed to support families and care for children. It emphasized that the program did not officially engage in forced reproduction or operate as a breeding experiment, though individual abuses did occur within the broader wartime context. The deeper controversies surrounding Lebensborn involved other aspects of the SS population policies, including the abduction and rehoming of children from Eastern Europe, an area still under historical debate and analysis. Both popular portrayals of Lebensborn as elite brothels or as mere charitable institutions miss the mark. In reality, Lebensborn was a carefully constructed tool within the broader racial policies of Nazi Germany. It was initiated by Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS, and designed to support an increase in the birth rate among people considered part of the so-called Germanic population. Lebensborn was only one small component of the extensive network of state and SS-run programs meant to influence demographics through ideology and policy. The foundations of Lebensborn were built on the belief that there existed distinct human races, each with inherited physical and mental traits, and that some of these races were superior to others. Nazi racial theory placed the Nordic or Germanic peoples at the top of this hierarchy. Such theories were treated as science at the time and used as justification for policies of population engineering. The goal was to build a greater Germanic empire, populated by people regarded as biologically fit to lead and dominate. This vision was not hidden, but openly expressed in political speeches and even in Hitler's own writings well before the Nazis came to power. After 1933, racial policy unfolded, simultaneously increasing the number of births among those considered valuable. The former included sterilizations, so-called euthanasia programs, deportations, and killings. The latter involved large-scale efforts to repatriate ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe, the abduction and re-education of children viewed as racially compatible, and the creation of support systems like Lebensborn to encourage childbirth among preferred populations. The Nazis treated each occupied region according to its perceived racial makeup. In Eastern Europe, the policy of Volkstumspolitik aimed to dominate, depopulate, and repopulate the region as part of the broader Lebensraum project. In contrast, Northwestern Europe was approached with the goal of eventual integration into a Germanic empire. Populations in Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, and parts of France were seen as more racially compatible, and thus Lebensborn clinics were also established in those countries. These facilities offered care and protection for expectant mothers who met the regime's criteria and who often had ties to German soldiers stationed in those regions. The ideological framework behind Lebensborn drew heavily from earlier 19th century ideas. Concepts like Lebensraum, blood and soil, and racial hierarchy were popularized through works by scientists, writers, and public figures long before the Nazis emerged. Eugenics and social Darwinism, in particular, played a major role. Thinkers like Francis Galton and Herbert Spencer had argued that selective breeding could strengthen the human race. In Germany, these ideas were taken further by figures like Wilhelm Schallmayer, whose work on negative eugenics, the prevention of reproduction by those seen as genetically unfit, was influential among SS policymakers. While some of these individuals were not aligned with Nazi ideology themselves, their writings provided pseudo-scientific backing for some of the policies of the 20th century. The Lebensraum program was, in many ways, the softer face of these ideas, focused on growth. Yet its quiet expansion was also a reflection of how deeply these theories had penetrated state structures, shaping not only military conquest, but intimate aspects of life, family, and identity. One of the most influential thinkers behind racial ideology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was the English-born writer Houston Stewart Chamberlain. Deeply influenced by the ideas of Arthur de Gobineau, Chamberlain published his most famous work, The Foundations of the 19th Century, in 1899. This massive book, spanning more than 2,000 pages, presented a worldview in which history was seen as a constant struggle between peoples, or what Chamberlain called races. He argued that the Germanic peoples represented the highest cultural force in history, while other groups posed a threat to this legacy. Though his definitions of race were often vague, sometimes referring to ethnic groups, sometimes religious communities, Chamberlain became a key figure in shaping popular beliefs about national and cultural superiority. His book was a bestseller and widely circulated across the German Empire. The German Kaiser himself endorsed the work, helping to introduce its ideas into school curricula and public libraries. Chamberlain also married Eva Wagner, the youngest daughter of the composer Richard Wagner, whose music and nationalist writings he deeply admired. Both Chamberlain and Wagner shared the belief that cultural and national strength were rooted in blood, heritage, and tradition. In the 1920s, Chamberlain met with Adolf Hitler, who admired both his writings and his connection to the Wagner family. These ideas didn't arise in a vacuum. Chamberlain's work built upon earlier theories proposed by thinkers like Gobineau. A French aristocrat, Gobineau believed that humanity could be divided into three major racial groups, white, black, and Asian, and argued that the so-called white or Indo-European peoples were responsible for creating civilization. He warned that the mixing of these groups would lead to cultural decline and chaos. Gobineau's writings found a particularly receptive audience in German-speaking countries, where interest in ideas like Indo-European heritage and ancient Aryan ancestry had been growing. By the early 20th century, these racial theories had merged with movements in science, philosophy, and even the arts to create an ideological framework that emphasized hierarchy, purity, and cultural destiny. Though now thoroughly discredited, these beliefs helped lay the groundwork for state policies that would later claim to be rooted in science and progress. Another major figure in the development of early 20th century racial theory was the American writer and zoologist Madison Grant. A graduate of Yale and Columbia, Grant published his most influential work in 1916, titled The Passing of the Great Race, or The Racial Basis of European History. Like Houston Stewart Chamberlain before him, Grant viewed human history as a conflict between distinct population groups, and he identified the so-called Nordic peoples as the primary drivers of civilization and progress. He warned that the continued mixing of different populations would lead to the weakening of society, and he proposed policies such as segregation and sterilization to preserve what he considered strong hereditary traits. Grant's ideas, later translated into German, were widely circulated in Europe and left a lasting impression on future political leaders, including Adolf Hitler. These beliefs were not unique to any one country. During the early 20th century, similar ideas spread across the Western world. In Germany, Grant's writings complemented those of Hans F. K. Günther, one of the most influential racial theorists of the period. Günther's book, Racial Science of the German People, published in 1922, became a bestseller and helped shape what was then referred to as race-based population policy. Günther proposed that Europe was composed of 6 primary racial groups, each with distinct physical and mental attributes. He argued that the Nordic peoples, especially those in Germany, were the strongest, and that national policies should aim to preserve and multiply their numbers. His proposed solution, which he called Northernization, envisioned a long-term population strategy that would take centuries to complete. Far from being isolated theories, these ideas reflected broader trends in early 20th century social science. Across Europe, North America, and even parts of South America, there were real legislative efforts to enforce eugenic policies. In the United States, laws were passed as early as the 1890s, restricting the right to marry for those with certain disabilities. In 1924, the U.S. Immigration Act, shaped in part by lobbying from Madison Grant and others, restricted immigration from Asia and other regions deemed non-assimilable. Several Western nations, including Sweden, Canada, and Argentina, adopted sterilization programs intended to prevent the reproduction of individuals considered genetically unfit. In colonial territories, concepts of racial hierarchy were used to justify policies of segregation, economic subjugation, and limited civil rights. By the time the Nazis came to power in Germany, the groundwork for population control through racial theory had already been laid in multiple countries. What made the German case unique was not the invention of these ideas, but the scale and extremity with which they were put into practice. The ideological foundation laid by thinkers like Gobineau, Chamberlain, Grant, and Günther played a direct role in the policies of the Third Reich, from forced sterilizations to selective breeding programs, and ultimately to racial deportations and violence on a massive scale. The idea that Germany needed more space to grow, what the Nazis later called Lebensraum, or living space, was not a creation of Adolf Hitler, but had been developing within nationalist and geopolitical thought since the 19th century. The German geographer Friedrich Russell had already argued that nations were living organisms that needed space to expand in order to survive. He believed that the strongest states would naturally outgrow the weaker ones through a process of selection that mirrored the principles of social Darwinism. This notion was further developed by Swedish political scientist Rudolf Kjellén, who emphasized that states needed to be organically connected to their territories. Both thinkers argued that larger, more self-sufficient nations were inherently more stable and more likely to thrive, while smaller states were destined to vanish over time. These ideas were not confined to academic circles. In the aftermath of Germany's defeat in World War I, themes of territorial loss, national humiliation, and the need for expansion took hold across a wide spectrum of German society. A notable example was Hans Grimm's 1926 novel Folk ohne Raum, People Without Space, which argued that Germany's problems stemmed from a lack of land. The book, which sold over 500,000 copies, popularized the idea that Germans were trapped, limited by borders, and unable to fulfill their true potential without acquiring more territory. Its title quickly became a slogan for the rising nationalist movements of the 1920s and 1930s, including the Nazis. A central figure in transforming these ideas into a form of applied geopolitical strategy was General Karl Haushofer. A former army officer and later professor of geography at the University of Munich, Haushofer became one of the most influential geopolitical thinkers in interwar Germany. He founded a journal and delivered public lectures and even radio broadcasts advocating a doctrine of territorial expansion. According to Haushofer, a state could only be truly secure and prosperous if it was fully self-sufficient, meaning it could feed and supply itself without reliance on foreign trade. In his view, densely populated countries like Germany had a natural right to expand into less populated neighbouring regions, particularly in the east. He viewed such expansion not as conquest, but as geopolitical necessity. These ideas were passed directly to Hitler through Haushofer's student and close associate Rudolf Hess, who later became Hitler's deputy. When Hitler was imprisoned in Landsberg following the failed beer hall putsch in 1923, Haushofer visited him and brought books on geopolitics. Passages in Mein Kampf concerning territorial expansion, race, and Germany's future foreign policy owe much to Haushofer's teachings. Ethnic nationalism and expansionist ideologies had deep roots in German political thought even before the Nazi era. The so-called Völkische movement, which gained enormous popularity in the decades before Hitler's rise, promoted the idea that the German people formed a unified, organic community, bound together by shared ancestry, culture, and language. Across Germany, dozens of nationalist associations emerged, some with memberships in the millions. These groups promoted ideas ranging from military rearmament and the unification of all ethnic Germans to territorial conquest and anti-Semitic policy. One important dimension of this ideology concerned the Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans living outside Germany's post-Versailles borders, especially in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. Numbering around 10 million, these communities became central to the Nazi argument that Germany had a duty to protect its people, even beyond its borders. After the annexation of the Sudetenland, Hitler's popularity surged as many Germans viewed him as the liberator of their kin. Among those most committed to implementing these racial nationalist policies was Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS. Devoted entirely to the racial doctrines of the regime, Himmler was entrusted by Hitler with executing the practical elements of population policy. While the SS was responsible for the vast machinery of terror and violence against those deemed unfit or undesirable, Himmler also sought to ensure the growth of what he considered a racially superior population. In 1936, he established the Lebensraum program. The goal of this project was to increase the birth rate of so-called racially valuable children, and to support mothers who fit the SS's strict hereditary criteria. Over the next 8 years, Lebensraum operated dozens of maternity homes across Germany and the occupied territories. Women who gave birth in these clinics were required to meet racial standards set by SS officers, and the children born there were often adopted into SS families or raised in environments aimed at ideological conditioning. The organization originally focused on unmarried mothers to prevent abortions and reduce stigma, but later expanded its services to married couples as well. Himmler envisioned Lebensraum as more than a welfare initiative. He believed it could lay the foundation for a new elite, a future nobility drawn from men and women who met the ideological and biological ideals of National Socialism. These children, he hoped, would form the leadership class of a new, greater Germanic empire, trained to dominate and govern in the years to come. In December 1935, under the direct order of Heinrich Himmler, the Lebensraum program was officially founded and registered as a state-recognized association in Germany. Though formally structured as a private organization, it functioned as a branch of the SS and reported through the Race and Settlement Office, or Russia. Himmler's decision to form Lebensraum at this moment reflected a combination of practical and ideological motivations. As Reichsführer of the SS and head of police in Bavaria, he had long been troubled by Germany's low birth rate, particularly among those he considered to be of good hereditary stock. He was also regularly exposed to the social challenges facing unmarried pregnant women, many of whom faced strong societal pressure to seek abortions or give up their children in secrecy. At the same time, the National Socialist People's Welfare Organization had already established support networks for Aryan mothers, and Himmler wanted the SS to exert its own influence over population policy. The primary goal of Lebensraum was to promote childbirth among women who met racial and hereditary criteria established by SS racial officers. It was intended to support expectant mothers during and after pregnancy, particularly unmarried women who might otherwise be marginalized. The first Lebensraum facility opened in 1936 in the village of Steinhöring near Munich and was followed by several more in the coming years. These were typically well-furnished maternity clinics or children's homes located in secluded and guarded estates. Inside, pregnant women received medical care and, if they gave birth successfully, were either encouraged to raise the child themselves or place it for adoption, often with SS families. The SS also claimed responsibility for the financial and material care of both mother and child in these facilities. While the official purpose of Lebensborn was charitable, offering care to mothers and children of hereditary value, the deeper intention was far more strategic. Himmler envisioned the creation of a new elite, a future leadership class that would form the backbone of a proposed greater Germanic empire. This ruling class was to be composed of men and women selected not only for their ideological loyalty, but also their physical and genetic traits. Lebensborn was to become one of the key tools in producing and nurturing this future generation. Himmler hoped to prevent at least 100,000 abortions each year through Lebensborn alone, which he estimated would result in the creation of nearly 500,000 new citizens over 3 decades, enough, he once said, to raise an army. By the outbreak of World War II, the organization had expanded. It grew to include around 30 facilities between 1936 and 1944, with 13 in Germany and Austria, 11 in occupied Norway, and others in occupied countries such as France, Belgium, and Poland. These branches functioned both as maternity homes and as children's residences, where newborns and toddlers could be raised or temporarily housed until adopted. Expansion slowed briefly due to mismanagement and lack of funding, but in 1940, Himmler appointed Max Zollmann as the new director, and the program underwent major restructuring. Financial controls were tightened, and new Lebensborn centers were opened in both Germany and occupied territories. The racial criteria behind the program remained central. Each prospective mother was required to prove her ancestry and that of the father, whether he was an SS officer or civilian. These criteria were overseen by the Russia, which conducted detailed investigations and maintained strict standards. In Himmler's view, every mother of good blood is sacred to us. The ultimate aim was not just to promote healthy births, but to shape an entire generation ideologically aligned and physically fitting for the regime's long-term vision. Lebensborn was also a natural extension of the SS marriage law, which required both husband and wife to be approved for racial suitability before receiving permission to wed. While Lebensborn focused heavily on preventing abortion and supporting childbirth among suitable women, it also became involved in more controversial practices as the war progressed. In occupied countries, particularly Norway and parts of Eastern Europe, children born to German soldiers and local women were sometimes brought into Lebensborn facilities. In some cases, children were taken forcibly or without full consent, especially if they fit the racial profile deemed desirable by SS standards. These children were placed into German homes, often renamed, and raised with the expectation they would grow up fully assimilated into the new Germanic order. Lebensborn's ambitions extended beyond simple birth support. It was part of a much larger ideological program to influence demography and ensure the continuity of the regime's values and racial framework into the future. Himmler frequently spoke of a new nobility arising from these families, a class of guardians who would eventually lead the new empire. Though framed as scientific and humanitarian, the program was rooted in a narrow and exclusionary worldview. It connected directly to broader policies of racial hierarchy, population control, and the long-term reshaping of society. In the early stages, nearly all Lebensborn facilities served a dual function, as both maternity clinics and children's homes. However, as time went on, the organization encountered logistical and health challenges. Many newborns remained in the homes for prolonged periods, sometimes as long as 2 years. This slowed the flow of new admissions, led to overcrowding, and contributed to the spread of illness. As a result, from 1942 onward, with few exceptions, new Lebensborn locations in Germany and Austria were established solely as children's homes rather than combined facilities. Despite continued expansion, demand consistently outpaced capacity. To address this, Lebensborn began using both public and private institutions to house and care for mothers and children. Even in these external facilities, oversight remained with Lebensborn personnel, and the organization covered all associated costs. Beginning in 1941, Lebensborn's activities expanded into occupied countries, focused specifically on the children of German soldiers and local women who met the organization's racial criteria. These efforts were implicitly endorsed by Hitler, initially in the Netherlands and Norway, and eventually extended to other territories. Norway became a focal point of this international expansion. Driven by the active involvement of the local SS leadership and the Reich Commissioner, a fully functioning Lebensborn system was set up there. While it followed the same general model as in Germany, Norwegian administrators had considerable autonomy, although they still received financial and logistical support from Munich. Other countries' branches remained directly under the central Lebensborn office in Germany. These included facilities in Belgium, France, and annexed Luxembourg. A facility in Denmark was also under construction, reportedly completed only weeks before the war ended. In the Netherlands, a large maternity hospital and children's home were completed in 1943 but were never officially opened. Meanwhile, in annexed areas of Poland, Lebensborn established boarding homes for young working women who had given birth under the program. Not all children housed in Lebensborn homes had been born within the organization's clinics or voluntarily placed under its care. From 1942, Lebensborn became officially involved in a more controversial aspect of the regime's population policy, the forced Germanization of foreign children. These children were not the offspring of voluntary applicants, but had been taken from orphanages, schools, or even directly from their families in occupied countries. The process began in Poland soon after the invasion, initiated by local authorities, and was later formalized under Himmler's directive. Children deemed to possess the desired physical characteristics were brought into Lebensborn custody. Some were infants, others were older, and underwent deliberate attempts to integrate them into German culture. This included assigning them new names, teaching them German, and placing them with adoptive families. Special homes were even established for the sole purpose of Germanizing these children. Many came from Poland, but others were taken from Czechoslovakia and Slovenia. In several cases, these children were the sons and daughters of resistance fighters or individuals arrested or killed during the occupation. Even though the Lebensborn organization officially encouraged voluntary participation, this didn't apply to the higher ranks of the SS. In September 1936, Heinrich Himmler made it mandatory for senior SS officers to join Lebensborn, reinforcing his belief that they should play an active role in shaping the future of the Germanic people. Lower-ranking SS men were urged to volunteer, but the response was far below expectations. Despite the SS growing to nearly 500,000 members by the war's peak, Lebensborn's total membership never exceeded approximately 17,000. Contributions to the organization weren't symbolic. Fees were calculated based on a man's age, rank, and number of children. Those with higher status and fewer children were expected to pay more. For Himmler, this wasn't just a matter of fundraising, it was about principle. He believed it was a national duty for every SS man to have many children. Those who failed to meet this ideal would still be expected to contribute financially to the state's population policy, with some payments reaching nearly 8% of their gross monthly salary. Additional funding came from several sources. Mothers who gave birth at Lebensborn facilities often had their medical costs covered by health insurance. Fathers of the children were also expected to make payments, although in practice, only a small percentage did so willingly or in full. While Lebensborn's existence was not a secret, the internal workings of the organization remained shrouded in selective secrecy. Publicly, the group maintained a press department, published brochures, and ran informational articles in both SS and commercial publications. There were even plans to release a promotional film, though it was never completed. Lebensborn openly advertised the availability of clinics and staff positions, and by the early 1940s, its name and function were known across much of occupied Europe. For example, the Dutch East Indies newspaper, De Sumatra Post, published an article in November 1940 that mentioned Himmler's encouragement of illegitimate births among SS men and the care provided to unmarried mothers, though the report erroneously stated that the largest maternity facility was named Lebensborn. Despite this openness, the organization maintained strict confidentiality concerning its clients, especially unmarried pregnant women. The chance to give birth anonymously was a significant reason many women turned to Lebensborn in the first place. While secrecy was optional, most unmarried mothers opted for it, whereas married women generally had no need for concealment. To support anonymity, Lebensborn clinics were almost always located in rural areas on secluded estates, often surrounded by fences or walls and monitored by guards. Once a woman had been approved by the central office in Munich and passed the racial screening process, she could be sent to a clinic far from home to avoid recognition. Inside the facilities, the women addressed each other only as Frau, followed by their first name. This was a rule designed not just to conceal identities, but to avoid distinctions between married and unmarried mothers. At Heimhochland, a prominent mothers' clinic, it was explicitly stated that asking about the father or spreading rumors would result in immediate expulsion. The organization also maintained tight administrative control over identities. In Nazi Germany, all citizens were legally required to register their residence with the police, so Lebensborn provided women with false addresses, often linked to staff members in Munich. By late 1939, this workaround became unnecessary, as Himmler had arranged for the creation of special Lebensborn registry offices, which kept all personal data classified. Even earlier, Lebensborn had received permission from the Ministry of the Interior to operate its own civil registry in each clinic. This allowed births to be recorded confidentially and played a crucial role later when foreign children were brought into the program. These legal loopholes enabled Lebensborn to assign new identities and documentation without interference from state authorities. In about half the cases, the organization also assumed custody of the newborns, ensuring that the involvement of government youth services could be bypassed and the parents' identities kept permanently hidden. In the ideology of the Third Reich, women were first and foremost viewed through the lens of their reproductive potential. Their value to the state was closely tied to their perceived racial background and ability to bear children considered to be of strong hereditary stock. The government implemented strict reproductive policies. Abortion was heavily penalized and, by 1943, could even lead to the death penalty. At the same time, relationships between Germans and individuals classified as racially unsuitable were forbidden. Furthermore, both men and women who suffered from certain hereditary conditions or congenital abnormalities could be subjected to forced sterilization. Within this framework, personal freedom and individual choice were subordinated to the interests of state policy, even in matters as intimate as marriage or reproduction. Within the SS, these views were enforced even more stringently. S members were not only expected to marry but to do so selectively. According to regulations issued within the SS, such as the Engagement and Marriage Order, an SS man could only marry a woman who met strict medical and racial criteria. She was expected to be healthy, hereditarily stable, and ideally of equal or higher racial classification. The underlying goal was not merely to preserve the existing population, but to enhance it through careful selection and breeding. To support this aim, SS men were instructed to educate themselves on racial theory to make informed choices when selecting a spouse. This message was echoed in the pages of Das Schwarze Korps, the official SS weekly, though adherence to these ideals remained inconsistent. In a speech in 1936, Himmler lamented that many SS men were still marrying women who, in his view, were of lesser racial quality. He attributed this trend to the perception that such women matured earlier were more physically attractive and more accommodating than others who, although deemed racially superior by SS standards, were often overlooked. By 1943, this concern had still not been resolved. Otto Haider, head of the SS marriage office within the Race and Settlement Main Office, RUSHA, advocated for the creation of a written matchmaking system to better connect eligible SS men with women deemed of high hereditary value. These women, he argued, often worked in nurturing or domestic professions and were rarely noticed by potential partners. Formalizing this connection, Haider believed, would ensure better quality offspring. SS leadership did not restrict their influence to the choice of spouse. They also set expectations regarding the number of children each couple should have. Himmler frequently emphasized this point in speeches. In 1939, he even issued a directive urging SS men to father at least one child before leaving for the front lines. By 1942, he stated publicly that limiting childbirth for personal or economic reasons was, in his view, unnatural and unacceptable. He dismissed the notion that having only 2 or 4 children was sufficient, instead promoting the idea that every woman should bear as many children as physically possible, regardless of her own preferences. This vision of women as essential producers of the next generation was both conservative and, in certain respects, unorthodox for its time. On one hand, women were reduced to a biological role as bearers of future generations. On the other hand, Himmler and his circle promoted the idea that women did not need to be married to have children, a belief that challenged prevailing conservative views on family and morality. This ideological contradiction caused tension even within the Nazi Party. While the party promoted larger families, the emphasis on unmarried motherhood was met with resistance by many, including traditionalist members. For Himmler, the issue had a personal dimension. According to his wartime masseur, Felix Kirsten, Himmler often cited the fact that his grandfather had been born out of wedlock as influencing his broader acceptance of non-traditional family structures. He reportedly argued that marriage, in its existing form, was an outdated institution rooted in religious doctrine, particularly that of the Catholic Church. In his view, it was unrealistic to expect a man to remain with one woman for his entire life. Such expectations, he believed, often led to marital unhappiness, infidelity, and most concerning to him, a lack of children. Himmler envisioned changes to marriage laws after the war. He proposed allowing certain SS officers to take a second wife and receive a well-paid government position to support 2 families. These unions, however, would remain under strict supervision. All 3 partners in this arrangement, both wives and the husband, would be subject to the same selection criteria. If the marriage produced no children after 5 years, an investigation into infertility would be conducted. If necessary, medical procedures would be offered to the woman at the state's expense. Should this fail to result in childbirth within 2 additional years, the marriage would be annulled. Himmler believed post-war Germany could no longer afford the luxury of childless marriages. Kirsten also claimed that Himmler had expressed even more radical ideas. He reportedly stated that in the post-war future, any woman considered racially valuable who reached the age of 30 without bearing children would be subject to mandatory participation in the Lebensraum program. These women, under orders from a future health agency, could be required to report at designated times and locations to undergo fertilization. Refusal, according to this alleged vision, could result in social expulsion or legal consequences. While it is impossible to verify the full accuracy of Kirsten's account, the overall consistency of Himmler's views in public and private speeches lends a degree of plausibility to these claims. What is known for certain is that in the spring of 1942, Himmler gave Lebensborn director Max Sollmann a classified directive. He ordered plans for the construction of a new and expansive central headquarters for Lebensborn, designed to accommodate the needs of approximately 400,000 unmarried women who, due to war casualties, were unable to find husbands. The envisioned building was to be grand and dignified, a monument to what Himmler described as the honor of unmarried motherhood. Though the project was never realized, it reflected a growing concern within Nazi leadership about the long-term demographic consequences of a prolonged war. Around the same time, Reich Health leader Leonardo Conti submitted a proposal to Himmler and Martin Bormann. With the Eastern Campaign stalled in the harsh winter of 1941–42, it had become clear to Nazi officials that the war would be longer and costlier than initially expected. Concerned about Germany's declining birth rate, Conti suggested exploring artificial insemination as a means to increase the population. Himmler immediately dismissed the idea. He argued that it would be socially unacceptable, biologically unnatural, and a threat to the racial integrity of future generations. In his view, such practices conflicted with the very foundations of the policies he had spent years enforcing. Himmler's worldview, built on the conviction that demographic strength could be engineered through selective breeding, strict marriage controls, and expanded motherhood, shaped the entire Lebensborn project, although not all of his ideas were implemented, and some remained theoretical or symbolic. They reveal how deeply the regime intended to reshape society by controlling the most private aspects of human life: reproduction, love, family, and identity, all in pursuit of a vision for the future population of a new Germanic empire. In the end, the Lebensborn program faded into obscurity with the collapse of the Third Reich. What began as an experiment in social engineering, aimed at shaping the future population through controlled reproduction and selective care, ultimately became one of the most controversial and misunderstood aspects of the Nazi regime. By 1945, most Lebensborn homes had either been abandoned, destroyed, or seized by Allied forces. Records were burned, staff disappeared, and many of the children who had been born under the program were left behind, their identities shielded behind secrecy or lost entirely. For many of these children, the end of the war did not bring clarity, but confusion. Some were adopted, others placed in institutions. In the post-war years, many grew up unaware of their true origins. Those who eventually uncovered their past were often left grappling with difficult questions about identity, heritage, and the ideology into which they were unknowingly born. In some occupied countries, such as Norway or France, Lebensborn children faced severe stigma, often branded unfairly as children of the enemy, despite having played no role in the politics of the war. As post-war Europe tried to rebuild, the Lebensborn legacy lingered in silence. It remained a topic largely avoided, rarely discussed in classrooms or courts. When it was remembered, it was often distorted by sensationalism, myth, or political agendas. Only decades later did researchers begin to carefully separate fact from fiction to uncover what Lebensborn really was: not a secret breeding cult, nor a vast network of eugenic laboratories, but a state-supported institution designed to manipulate family life, childbirth, and human identity in service of a larger ideological project. If you found this documentary insightful, please give it a like and share it with others who value real history over myth. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dive content like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again very soon.